Clint is a Master of Arts in Psychology, a registered polysomnographic technologist, an expert in sleep medicine and fatigue, and is the first person to be qualified by the Superior Court of Canada as an expert witness in sleep-related fatigue. So, Clint, the floor is yours for your presentation on investigating human fatigue in safety incidents, one big risk factor to consider.
Thank you, Graham, and good morning, everybody. Now, I just want to say that I have been given the most precious spot as a speaker across one whole year. And that is because we've just moved to standard time. And if you recall, we fell back. That gave most of us an extra hour of sleep on Saturday night. Hopefully you went to bed at a decent time yesterday, and now you are fresh and ready to go. Unfortunately, the most challenging position or slot for a speaker is in the afternoon. Now, I asked Amanda and the rest of the team here, I be on in the morning to take advantage of that? Hopefully, I won't mess it up and put you all to sleep. You know, I do find that when I start talking about sleep and fatigue, I see people yawning, the eyes start to close, and they start drifting off. Something happens. There's a suggestion there, but let's hope it doesn't happen, and hopefully I can set the stage for a great presentation. And a wonderful next 3 days for you. I did take a look at the speaker lineup, and it looks really great. So you're in for some great speakers. Okay. The next few slides are going to show you some pretty catastrophic incidents that you may recall. And they all have one thing in common. So we have the 3 Mile Island disaster, Bhopal gas leak, the Chernobyl meltdown, the Formosa Plastics explosion in 2004, and the BP Texas refinery explosion in 2005. All of these catastrophes have one thing in common, and that is that fatigue played a contributing role to all of them, right? So it's something to do with fatigue influenced these accidents such that if you were to remove the fatigue component, you may have prevented the accident. Now I say may, because if everybody's in process safety here, it's really not a chain of actions, that discrete chain. So if you remove the fatigue, it changes the whole system. But there's a good chance you would have reduced the risk that these incidents would have happened. Now, these incidents are one of the reasons organizations similar to yours have said that we need to look at fatigue differently. We need to start looking at identifying the hazards that are resulting in fatigue so that we can prevent these catastrophes from happening in the future. It's also one of the reasons that you invited one of my colleagues, Jason Kumagai, to speak to your association back in 2015. Now, I know Jason introduced some of the catastrophes that I just mentioned to you, so some of them are probably familiar to you. Now, you might be saying, yeah, but these accidents, these incidents aren't happening every day. Fatigue is not that great a concern. I'm going to flip it around a little bit for you. And I'm going to get you to think that although we might not be blowing up our chemical plants every day because of fatigue, there are a number of hidden costs that fatigue science has shown are occurring every single day. So fatigue is costing us financially, it's costing us in the safety spectrum, the health spectrum, and in the productivity spectrum every single day. Now, that sounds like a pretty bleak statement, but I think it's actually a positive statement, because if the costs are there already, right, we're already incurring these costs, we're already paying for them, they're built into the budget already. What you can do is we can flip it around. So rather than allow the hidden costs to continue, what we can do is we can flip it around. We can do something differently with fatigue. We can manage it differently. We can look at it differently and then recuperate some of those costs. So we can turn this into a benefit that will hopefully show some sort of return on our investment, either a financial one or some other measurable benefit. So let me give you a couple of examples of what science has shown is directly related to fatigue, or at least fatigue plays a very strong contributing role. So one of the things we know is that fatigue plays a role in safety. And in particular, the task of driving our cars is really sensitive to fatigue. So the negative side is that if you work a really long day, you're at about a 16% greater risk of a car accident when you drive home. So if we flip it around, hey, let's shorten the day. We're now going to reduce the risk of a motor vehicle accident by 16%. That's a pretty good improvement. We also know that people who have sleep problems, so classified as sleep disorders, everybody's probably heard of one called obstructive sleep apnea, where you stop breathing at night. If you address sleep disorders, so forget about all the other reasons we're fatigued, like shift work, disrupted sleep due to sleep quality issues, maybe you're sleeping in a hotel. Forget about those. Think about the clinical diagnoses. If all you do is address sleep problems, you can drop sick leave by 28%. You translate that into financial figures. I looked at it and I did some estimates for a small organization of about 100 people. You could get back close to $4 million across 10 years just in sick leave costs alone. So there's a great financial benefit. Of course, fatigue is related to sleep issues, and we know there's a really tight link now between sleep and our mental health, depression, anxiety, stress. So we can reduce those rates as well. You can also see some great improvements in longer term benefits. If you deal with sleep and fatigue now, you could live longer. So we can prolong our lives if we deal with this hazard a little bit differently. There's one really neat finding, and that is you might actually save gasoline too. You're not going to burn as much fuel. This comes from a really interesting railway study where they looked at how fatigued operators operate their trains. One of the major impacts of fatigue is that our reaction time slows down. So if you can think about yourself sitting in a locomotive cab, and in front of you, you see a train that is either stopped or slowed down. If your reaction time is slow, it's going to take your brain and body time to process that information and produce some sort of action, which would be apply some brake. Okay? So now it's taken you longer to brake, and we know that trains take a long time to brake and a long time to accelerate again. So once that train in front of you has moved on, what you do is you don't want to let the trains behind you start to accumulate, so you apply some really hard throttle. Very inefficient way of driving your train. Now, I haven't seen any studies on this, but I suspect that because our reaction time is impaired universally, it's not just locomotive operators, we're all humans, we'd probably drive our cars in a very similar fashion, right? So a car slows down in front of it, what do? You brake hard. The traffic picks up again, you want to be left behind, so you floor it, right? So you're going to burn more gasoline. So there's all sorts of really great hidden costs that we can now turn into hidden benefits if we do things a little bit differently with fatigue. So question for you is, are you ready to take on this challenge to manage fatigue differently, to look at it a little differently, and to think about what are we doing with it a little differently? Hopefully in your mind you're thinking, well, yeah, possibly, we might want to look at it. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to illustrate one way to deal with fatigue a little bit differently. And rather than focus on one of those major accidents or incidents, which we read in textbooks, but hopefully none of us have ever actually gone through, I'm going to use something that we are familiar with. And I'm going to go back to the example of driving. Okay? One of the things that we see is that in most of the accident reports for highway accidents, motor vehicle accidents, they don't cite fatigue. One of the reasons is because it's not really being investigated or studied well enough in those accident reconstruction scenarios. If, however, you dig into the science behind accidents, so you're not just, what we call an accident reconstructionist, one of these engineering-minded police officers doing an accident reconstruction, you're an actual scientist looking into fatigued driving incidents. What you see is the numbers are pretty high. Upwards of 15 to 20% of all motor vehicle accidents could be related to fatigue. Now, if you then poll people and you ask, forget about being in an accident, have you ever driven fatigue? Across Canada, this is a Canadian finding, 60% of Canadians admit they have occasionally driven while fatigued. So it is quite prevalent. If you haven't driven fatigue, then perhaps you've seen a colleague or a friend maybe nod off a little while fatigued. So I think we can all kind of relate to this. So fatigue is a contributor to lots of accidents and incidents, but one of the reasons it's not showing up in the stats is because we're not really looking at it differently. So here's one way to look at it a little differently. We can start taking the safety studies, the incidents, the accident investigations, and start incorporating a method to look at fatigue. Okay? And the method I'm going to introduce to you is a two-step method. This is the method that Graham said I helped the TSB refine when I was their fatigue specialist. And I've turned it into a multi-step that can be thought of two major steps. And the first thing you have to do is look at whether or not the people involved in the accident or incident were fatigued. And in my methodology, I call these actors. What do actors do? Actors do actions. So the first step is look at, was the actor fatigued? Second step is, were the actions of the actor consistent with what you would expect from a fatigued person? Okay, so that's the little process I'm gonna lead you through here. Now, to show this, I'm going to describe a pretty nasty accident that happened a few years ago. This was a chartered passenger bus, and they were coming back from Niagara Falls, and about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the driver drifted off the highway, went down an embankment. So on the screen right now, you should be seeing a highway schematic. The road going sort of northeast, so upwards to the top, is the road he was supposed to stay on. And that sort of curvilinear line that kind of squiggles across diagonally is the path he ended up taking. So he drifted off the road, and what's not shown in the schematic here there was an embankment. It went downhill. So he went off the road, went down the hill. The on-ramp, hopefully you can see my cursor moving around. The on-ramp, he skidded across the on-ramp, hit the I-beam, pulled 700 feet of that I-beam across the roadway, took 3 or 4 cars with him, tipped over and over and over. At the end, we had 5 people killed, 42 injured, I think it was. Only 1 person got away without any injuries. Okay, so let's pull this one apart a little bit to demonstrate this method that I'm talking about. So we have to figure out, is the actor fatigued, or were they fatigued at the time the incident occurred? So let me ask you this question. Could you measure fatigue right after an accident? Could you run over to that driver and apply some sort of measuring tool to say, are you fatigued right now? Well, here's one way of doing it, and let's test everybody. So what I'd like you to do is take out a pen, okay? Take out a pen and scribble down on a piece of paper your answers to the following few questions. And what I'd like you to do is envision yourself in the scenarios I'm going to describe, and then imagine whether or not you would fall asleep in that scenario. Okay? And the scale we're going to use is 0, 1, 2, or 3, where 0 in that situation, yep, no problem, I would never fall asleep, never doze off. 3, pretty good chance you're going to doze off in that situation. Now, don't answer it as to how you're feeling right now. Average it out across, say, the last 3 weeks or month or so. Average it out across the day as well. Okay, so here we go. First situation, you're sitting down and reading. Remember, 0, no chance, 3, pretty high chance, 1 and 2 in the middle there. Slight chance versus moderate chance. Okay, write down your number. Okay, 0, 1, 2, or 3. Next one, you're watching TV. Now, before you answer this one, think about where you normally watch TV. It's usually at your house, friend's house, family member's house. And if you fall asleep and people see your head nodding and your eyes closing and they start giggling at you, ah, look at Clint, he's falling asleep. Who cares? You know, it's your friends and family laughing. It doesn't really matter. Okay? So in that scenario, across any time during the day in the last 3 weeks or so, what's the likelihood you'd fall asleep? 0, 1, 2, or 3. Next one. Now you're in a public place, maybe a meeting at work, or in these, these huge shopping malls where you can sit in a nice comfortable couch and wait for your shopping partner. People looking at you, you don't know them, that they start giggling at you, a little bit more embarrassing. Or at work, you don't want your work colleagues to laugh at you in a meeting, so a little harder, but 0, 1, 2, 3, where would you fall? Next one, you're a passenger in a car, and you've been driving along for about an hour without a break. Now again, before you answer this one, the condition here is you have to be comfortable with the driver. Okay? So you're not sitting on the passenger side with your hands clamped onto the dash, white knuckling it. Okay? So you're comfortable with the driver, you can relax, let them drive. What's the likelihood you'd fall asleep if you've been driving along for about an hour and you haven't stopped for any breaks? Okay? Next one. Now you're lying down in the middle of the afternoon. A buddy of mine calls this forbidden sleep, right? Nobody's home. Sure, you've got a to-do list. You put the to-do list away. It's nice and quiet. I'm going to take a nap. So when circumstances permit and you try and get some of that lovely forbidden sleep, what's the likelihood you would actually fall asleep if you were trying to nap, trying to sleep? 0, 1, 2, or 3. Next one, you're sitting down and chatting with somebody. And you like the person, so you want to stay engaged in the conversation. What's the likelihood you'd stay awake then? And you're sitting. The clincher here is you're sitting, right? You're not lying down. You're not standing. You're sitting down and talking with somebody. 0, 1, 2, or 3. Next one, you're sitting down after lunch and you haven't had any drinks at lunch. No spirits, no wine, no beer. Sitting down quietly, not doing anything, not talking to anybody, not watching TV. You're just sitting there. What's the likelihood you would fall asleep in that situation? Okay. Next one, and this is the last one, by the way. You're now the driver and you've stopped in traffic for a few minutes. You've hit a traffic snarl. Maybe there's some construction or something in front of you. And by few, I mean 3 minutes or more. No passenger. What's the likelihood you'd fall asleep just sitting there in your car? Okay. Now total up your score. Okay. Don't tell me your score because I don't want to be afraid by seeing these scores if you're coming in the oncoming traffic on the drive home. So just keep your score to yourself. What I just had you do is what is known as the Epworth Sleepiness Scale. It is a very reliable instrument for estimating what we call sleep-related fatigue. Would it be, however, a good instrument for assessing our bus driver's fatigue level after that crash? Think about that just for a minute. Okay. Would you be able to walk over to that bus driver and use the Epworth to say, were you fatigued? So if you remember how I framed the use of it, I said, don't answer it as to how you are feeling right now. Average it out across the last 3 weeks or a month or so. This is what the Epworth Sleepiness Scale was designed for. So you might be saying, well, if it's averaged out across the last week or so, or last 3 weeks, I should say, it might have no bearing on how you're feeling right now. And perfectly correct, you're right. How I felt last week or on average might be very different from how I'm feeling right now. I mentioned that we are into standard time, and a lot of us got an extra hour of sleep. Maybe you're feeling great today, but at the end of the week, you're going to be back to normal, a little bit more fatigued. Okay? The other reason I think that it's probably hard to use scales like this to measure fatigue is that right after an accident or an incident, they are very stressful things to go through. Even if the accident or incident isn't that stressful, having somebody ask you about how you're feeling is stressful. So your adrenaline, your epinephrine levels are going to go up, and it could mask any fatigue you might have been experiencing. So it's not really a good tool to use. There are other ones that come a little bit closer. One is called the Karolinska Sleepiness Scale, the KSS, and it's designed to measure fatigue in the last 5 or 10 minutes. So it's a bit better, but you still have the challenge of that adrenaline rush after an incident. So that you can't really get in there and measure fatigue after an incident in somebody. There's no blood test, there's no saliva test, there's no scale, pen and paper scale that can help either. Let's go back to your numbers. Add up your numbers, and we'll tell you where you landed on the scale shortly. Now notice or remember that I mentioned that this scale is designed to measure what we call sleep-related fatigue. This is very different from other sources of fatigue that are often referred to as mental fatigue or physical fatigue. Mental fatigue, if I were to change this way I speak and your organizing team gave me 6 hours to talk, so if I was to turn it around and kind of talk like this in a very monotonous fashion, I'm not going to move very much, and I'm just going to tell you all sorts of stats for the next 6 hours. Trying to focus on that would become mentally fatiguing. At some point, you're going to have trouble paying attention. And you might describe it as, I'm fatigued. That speaker was terrible. He fatigued me. But just because you've listened to me drone on for an hour doesn't mean you're going to fall asleep more quickly, although we describe it as being fatigued. Okay? Here's another one. And I know most of you got your cameras off, but try this. Put your hand up in front of your forehead. Okay, and open and close your palm. Okay, make sure your arm is up so you feel a little bit of strain right here, and keep doing that. Okay, now keep doing it for 3, 4, 5 hours. Okay, everybody, you can put your arms down. What's probably the first thing that's going to happen? Well, your arm is going to become tired and you won't be able to do it any longer. And if I asked you how you felt, you might say, I feel fatigued. But just because you've done this for 3 or 4 hours doesn't mean you're going to fall asleep more quickly. Okay? Now, it's important to know the types of fatigue because the solutions for each type are different, although we describe it as being a very similar phenomenon. The solution for this, stop doing this. The solution for mental fatigue, take a break. You don't have to get sleep. Take a break. Come back to the task later on. Okay? So the types of fatigue are very important because we need to know that the solutions are different for each one. Okay, so the Epworth Sleepiness Scale, where did you find yourselves? Here's the scale we normally use. Now, if you look at most people across Canada, we will score somewhere in the neighborhood of 7 or 8. That's the average, the mean. Doesn't mean it's a good thing, right? Where we like to see people is 1 to 6. So what it means is, although you're average, you're the same as everybody else out there, there is room for improvement for most of us in Canada. We can get longer sleep and better sleep to drive that number down a little bit. Now, this is really important in safety critical situations too. And people in transportation, so if people are driving equipment that are carrying some of the chemicals that are being manufactured, let's say, transportation workers are even more fatigued than the average, which increases their risk of some sort of fatigue-related incident. Okay, so first point to remember is that you can't rush out to an accident and test somebody or measure their fatigue levels. A better approach of doing it is to look at the actor's sleep. Remember, the actor is the person involved in it. Look at their sleep pattern across the last week or so and compare it to what I call textbook normal sleep. By textbook normal sleep, I mean the type of sleep that you need on average to feel like you're physically, mentally restored, to keep you awake and alert until close to bedtime again, and make sure it's the quantity and the quality that you get. Okay? And we know from a textbook standpoint is that the farther away you are from that textbook view or that textbook picture of sleep, textbook version of sleep, the higher the likelihood you will be experiencing sleep-related fatigue. Okay, so here's normal sleep. Here's what I slept. If the delta is big, higher likelihood of fatigue. So what does textbook normal sleep look like? Well, I mentioned that there's a quality and a quantity component to it. On average, we need about 7, usually about 8 hours is where we say the average is. And somewhere between 6 and 9 hours, depending on the textbook or the journal article you read. The normal range is somewhere between 6 and 9 hours. So as long as you're falling in there and you're feeling pretty good up until bedtime, chances are you're doing okay. Now, you don't just fall asleep, have 7 hours, 8 hours of great sleep, and then wake up and then move on. What you do is you transition through a number of different sleep stages. So a good quality of sleep must contain the 4 different sleep stages in about these proportions that you're seeing. And notice that most of your sleep is stage 2. Stage 1 doesn't feel like sleep, right? So it's a very light sleep, but you still need some of it. So stage 2 followed by REM. REM sleep is the dreaming sleep. It's called rapid eye movement sleep. And then stage 3 and then stage 1. If you get too much stage 1, it feels like you're awake throughout the night or pockets in the middle of the night. Quality sleep is poor, you're going to feel fatigued, even though you might get 8 hours of sleep. Okay? A night of sleep looks something like this. This is a textbook hypnogram. So on the left-hand side of the screen is going to bed, on the right-hand side of the screen is getting up. And you'll notice that you transition through the sleep stages in what we call sleep cycles. Sleep cycles are about 90 minutes long. So if your sleep approximates this pattern, you're said to have pretty good quality of sleep. So quantity and quality sleep are important. Okay, how can you increase that delta between textbook sleep and the sleep you obtained? I usually refer to 6 different ways that you can sort of mess up that pattern, mess up your sleep. Okay? We don't have time to go through them all, so I'm just going to illustrate my method of looking at accidents and incidents, safety incidents, by using one of these, what I call fatigue risk factors. So just really briefly, Acute is in the short term, messing up your sleep quality or quantity. Um, Sleep debt refers to a chronic disruption to the sleep quality or quantity. When you talk about sleep debt, we're referring to specifically not getting enough sleep, so the quantity component. But you can also have circadian rhythm effects going on. You can stay awake for too long. You can have medical and psychological conditions, illnesses, and drugs that can produce fatigue or result in fatigue. And of course, sleep disorders play a big role in fatigue as well. So let's specifically talk about sleep debt. Sleep debt uses this concept of the requirement for 8 hours of sleep per night. Okay? If we have 8 hours of sleep per night, and really it's not 8 hours of sleep per night, it's we require 8 hours of sleep for every 24 hours of life to not be fatigued. Okay? So if you are awake at, say, 11 o'clock tonight, and you count back 24 hours, if you can't count 8 hours of sleep within that 24 hours, you're likely going to be more fatigued. It's not going to be guaranteed you're fatigued, but your risk of fatigue will be greater. Okay? So we now have this ratio, 8 hours of sleep, 24 hours of life, 1 to 3, or 24 hours of sleep minus, 24 hours of life minus 8 hours of sleep leaves 16 hours of wakefulness. So now we've got 8 hours of sleep buys you 16 hours of wakefulness, which gives you a ratio of 1 to 2. 1 hour of sleep buys you 2 hours of wakefulness. Okay? And we can calculate our sleep debt based on this concept. Okay? So now if you go online and you type in sleep debt calculator, you'll find hundreds and hundreds of calculators. Most of them are biologically incorrect. And the reason they're incorrect is that if we go with the concept of you need 8 hours of sleep for 16 hours of life, in a 24-hour period, if you sleep less, you are awake longer, right? So if I sleep for 6 hours, well, now I'm awake for 18 hours. So you actually need more sleep, right, to deal with that 18 hours of wakefulness. Most of the sleep debt calculators simply look at calculating, did you get 8 hours of sleep every night for the last 5 nights? If not, if you got 6 hours, you're 2 hours short for 5 days. Now you got a 10-hour sleep debt. That's an underestimate of the sleep debt because it doesn't consider the dual facet or the dual state of our existence, asleep or awake. Right? If you're awake longer, you're asleep less. Therefore, you need more sleep. Okay? So this is the concept of this ratio. So the formula we can use to calculate our sleep debt is you take the total sleep time that the person obtained across whatever period you're looking at, and you take the total awake time. The awake time you divide it by 2, and then you look at the difference there. If there's a negative difference, you have a sleep debt. So how big a sleep debt is too big? Where should we put that cutoff? Well, one of the things you have to look at, and for the mathematical folks in the audience here, one of the things you might be looking at is what we haven't looked at is the rate of accumulation. Okay? So this is one sort of a flaw in this formula. If, however, you accumulate, so let me just give you a quick example. If I'm say I'm an 8-hour sleeper, and I sleep for 7 hours and 58 minutes for 6 years. According to the formula I gave you, I would probably have a fairly large sleep debt. But is sleeping 2 minutes less than you require going to have an impact on you? Probably not. That's what I mean by rate of accumulation. Okay, so forget about those long rates of accumulation. Let's talk about more normal rates of accumulation. So if you accumulate a sleep debt of, say, 2 hours in a very short-term fashion, say over the last couple of nights, some aspects of your performance are degraded to levels that we see in people with blood alcohol concentrations just shy of the legal limit in many provinces in Canada, 0.05%. So if you bump it up to 0.05 rather than 0.045, you're in at least the legal warning range across Canada. They might not arrest you and throw you in jail, but they can take your license and car away temporarily. Okay? So if you don't want to be driving a car at that in that state, you probably don't want to be doing other safety critical activities. Okay? Bump it up now. A 4-hour sleep debt accumulated relatively quickly, so across the last couple of nights, gives your performance similar to like you've got a blood alcohol concentration of 0.095%, and that is illegal across Canada. Okay? So that's relatively small sleep debts accumulated in a very short fashion. If, however, you look back, say, across more like 7 days or a week or so, what do you see? Well, if we need 8 hours of sleep for every 24 hours of life, or 8 hours of sleep buys you 16-hour wakefulness, if you are missing 8 hours of sleep, some aspects, not all, some aspects of your performance are like you're missing a whole night of sleep. Now, I can't remember the last time I went without a whole night of sleep. Perhaps you can. And I would say that if you're thinking about pulling an all-nighter, you probably didn't feel good the next day. Okay? That's missing an 8 hours of sleep, and very similar to having a sleep debt of 8 hours. If we bump it up to 10 hours sleep debt, what we see is a very reliable finding, and that is your reaction time slows down. Okay? And as a driver, you need quick reaction times. If you're traveling at 100 kilometers an hour, somebody stops in front of you, or you notice, like our bus driver, you're swerving off the road, you need to react really quickly. If you're at 140%, seconds matter here, so it might be too long. Okay? All right, let's go back to our motor coach operator here. Okay? And let's pull this apart a little bit. Let's see what type of sleep debt this motor coach operator gave. Now, here's the backstory. This motor coach driver, this bus driver, on Friday night, arrived at the bus terminal at about 12:30 Friday. Okay, Friday, or sorry, into Saturday. Friday into Saturday, arrives at the bus terminal at 12:30, starts driving, and then they arrive in, and they left from Waterbury, Connecticut. This was a U.S. accident, but they drove all the way to Niagara Falls, Ontario, so the Canadian side of things, and they arrive in Niagara Falls on 7:30 Saturday morning. Okay? And the people on the bus, you know, they slept throughout the drive, and they go off and they hang out in Niagara Falls. Some go to the casino. Our bus driver goes to his hotel room. And although the details are a little sketchy here, the bus driver could have obtained upwards of 3.5 hours of sleep, but there's some data to suggest, like text messages, phone calls, that he didn't actually sleep in his hotel room. Okay? At noon on Saturday, the bus driver goes to, sorry, Friday, left Friday morning. I was mistaken there. So 12:30 Friday morning. Drives all day, arrives at the Niagara Casino early Saturday morning, 10 o'clock. 3 hours of sleep, possibly. At noon Friday, the driver goes to the casino, okay, and stays in the casino from noon on Friday all the way into the afternoon, overnight, and comes back to his hotel room 10 o'clock in the morning on Saturday. There's a possibility he might have obtained maybe 4 3/4 hours of sleep in that time period. But again, there's some evidence to suggest he probably didn't sleep that much. And then he goes back to the casino at 1600 Saturday afternoon. Stays in the casino all afternoon, evening, into Sunday morning. Sunday morning, there's a key swipe in his hotel room door, and he's in there for about 2.5 hours. Okay? At 12:30, goes back to his bus, loads his passengers, starts driving home. And then at 3 o'clock in the afternoon is when he goes off the road and the terrible accident happens. Okay? So his sleep pattern and wake pattern probably looks something like this. Each horizontal line here is a 24-hour period. If we assume that the bus driver slept for a good 8 hours every night leading up to the occurrence, we can then start calculating the sleep debt after that point. Okay? So you see here, the black is likely when the driver was driving. Blue is when the driver was sleeping. And I've written down the numbers that I expressed in the backstory that I told you. Okay? Now I've done the math for you. If you add up the awake duration across that time period and the sleep duration across the time period, you divide the awake by 2 using the formula I gave you, you get a 15-hour sleep debt. So let's go back to what I said. I said at 10 hours sleep debt, your reaction time is possibly 140% longer than somebody who's normally rested. Okay? So what she experienced is what we refer to as a microsleep. It's also referred to as state instability. You can no longer control your state of consciousness when you get to a certain level of fatigue. Extremely dangerous scenario, and there's a good chance that this is what happened with our bus driver. Okay? Awake for that long across the 3 or 4 days we described, that backstory built up a sleep debt of 15 hours, equivalent of missing almost 2 full nights of sleep. So he was pretty fatigued as he was driving home. So based on the sleep debt alone, it's pretty easy to then make a conclusion, something like it's highly likely the motor coach operator, or actor in this scenario, was fatigued. Notice highly likely. I always attach a probability statement there. There could be some variable we've missed here. But given the evidence we've seen, pretty good chance he was fatigued and during that drive home. Okay? So now we have done the first step. We've determined our actor was fatigued. Next step is, are the actions the actor performed consistent with what you'd expect from a fatigued person? Okay. Step number 2, look at the actor's action. Is it reasonable that the actions were consistent with somebody who's fatigued? There are a few very consistent findings, very consistent impairments that occur when we're fatigued. 2 of the noteworthy ones for driving are your ability to react quickly and your ability to stay focused on the task. In the research, will often refer to this as vigilance, your ability to maintain vigilance. Sometimes it's referred to as your attentional abilities, ability to stay focused on the task, screen out the unimportant information, but still pay attention to some of the tangential stuff that you need to drive, like where you are on that road. Now, these performance impairments also result in some very consistent driving patterns. Okay? If you have a very long reaction time or you're unable to maintain vigilance, that is, pay attention, it often means that you can't, your brain can't process what's going on in front of you. So for our bus driver, probably saw that there was a road in front of him and an off-ramp that he wasn't supposed to take, but didn't process the information of drifting over to the side. So we often see that there's no pre-crash maneuver here, right? They're not trying to change lanes. They're not really doing anything whatsoever. They're just trying to stay straight. We also see that because of the attention abilities and the slow reaction time, there's often a drift out of the lane they're supposed to be in. If your brain does pick up that you're in a safety critical situation, your reaction time is usually so long that you can't do any corrective action. You can't slam on those brakes or swerve. Okay? Also, now this doesn't have anything to do with performance impairments, but these crashes are often occurring where there's only one person in the vehicle. And this kind of makes sense because if there's somebody else in the vehicle, they might notice that you're drifting out of lane and be able to wake you up, right? So this is a bit of a pattern unrelated to performance. Young male as well. And that is because, not because they're just generally riskier drivers. There's actually a phenomena that occurs in the aging brain. It takes the males longer for their brains to mature, so they don't consciously process risk the same as everybody else, so they drive a little bit faster. Okay? These occurrences also happen in the middle of the night when our brain and body are programmed to be asleep, and they occur at higher speeds and often in more rural areas as well, okay, rather than the urban area. And if there are no pre-crash maneuvers, no avoidance maneuvers, and reaction time is long, attention is low, they are often serious crashes. Okay? Now, if we go back and compare our bus driver to these these fatigue-related patterns in crashes. Was there any pre-crash maneuver? No, he wasn't trying to change lanes. Did he drift out of the lane? Yes, drifted out of the lane. Was there any corrective action there? No evidence of any skidding in there. He was one of many occupants, so that one doesn't apply. He was male, but he was a little older, so that one doesn't really apply as well. Did it happen in the middle of the night? No, it happened in the middle of the afternoon. However, in the middle of the afternoon, we do also experience a biological drop in our alertness, and it happens right around 3 o'clock, which is when this occurrence happened. Did it happen in a rural area? Well, it was somewhat rural, but the more consistent component here is that it happened at highway speed, so slightly higher. Was it serious? Yes, it was definitely serious. We had 5 people who were killed in this particular incident. So if we then look at this occurrence, and here's a sort of a bird's eye view, we have I think about 5 different characteristics of fatigue-related crashes, motor vehicle accidents, that are consistent with what happened in our case. And we've probably got some pretty good arguments that reaction time was slow, and his ability to stay focused on the task, which was driving, was probably pretty low as well. Okay? So we've got slowed reaction time, vigilance, consistency with fatigue-related crashes. Pretty easy to then make our conclusion that, yes, this actor's actions were consistent with what you'd expect from a fatigued person. The actor we've also shown was fatigued. Therefore, it's pretty likely that fatigue played a role in this occurrence. So that's the 2-step process. Now, some take-home points, and then let me just give you one more, because we did talk about, are you ready to manage or look at things differently? Well, if you look at your safety incidents a little bit differently, you might find that fatigue is playing a bit more of a role than you thought, and then we need some tips on managing it. So, a couple of take-home points for now. If you're a driver, never drive with a high sleep debt. If you're a safety professional, think about looking at fatigue in your incidents first by starting to look at whether or not a sleep debt was a contributor. Okay? And then if you can, look at the other 5 fatigue risk factors to build that more complete picture of whether or not the person was fatigued. Safety pressures as well. Think about whether or not you can use the method that I just taught you to look at, sure, safety incidents, but whether or not you can pull apart the reasons for people calling in sick, the reasons for productivity decreases as being related to fatigue, and turn some of the hidden costs that I mentioned into benefits, get a reward on this investment. Thank you very much for listening. We do have about 5 minutes for a Q&A.